experience with gender identity, I identify as gender non-binary.
That's definitely something that I've struggled about, because it's not necessarily something that's set in stone, but it feels like it should be set in stone.
I don't think it's been a very difficult experience, since I do identify as female, and that's kind of what I was raised being and what I still identify with.
My experience with gender identity has been a situation in which I have gone back and forth on how I personally identify. I eventually settled on using all pronouns because I feel like that best identifies with me.
Well, I identify as non-binary. A couple months ago, I identified with she/they pronouns because I wasn't really letting myself use they/them pronouns, because it's a bit difficult to interact with other people when you identify with something that's not cis.
Right now it's sort of I know I'm not a man, but trans femme, I guess.
I don't really care for labels that much. I don't label myself in any way, my sexuality or my gender, because it's just I'm a person, and I think that's what matters. So ultimately, I'm just I don't really care how people address me, but I usually hear it.
I've had, I'd say, a unique experience with gender identity, being labeled as a girl, and then later on, figuring out, nah, that's not who I am, and then experiencing being male while living in a traditionally Latino household.
There's been tension, I guess, because I sort of fall in the in-between. I identify as non-binary, and it's sort of in between, so there's a lot of confusion sometimes for me, because I'm always told one or the other, not neither or both, or I don't even know at this point.
I'm Mexican American. I was born here. Both my parents immigrated here from Mexico.
Latina, Mexican, Hispanic, Chicana.
I identify as a South Asian Mexican.
I identify as African American.
I was raised Latina.
White, I guess technically Irish.
I'm Hispanic. My parents are both from Mexico.
Latino, I'm half Mexican, half Honduran.
I am mixed technically, but I tend to identify more with my Indian American side.
Most people, when asked to list the genders, will probably give one answer: male and female. Although, as of recently, some Americans are starting to shift their viewpoint as social norms and ideas about gender identity are changing. It is easy to think that the inclusion of other genders is happening solely because of America's growing social awareness. However, in several cultures across the world, having more than two rigid genders has been the norm for ages. Specifically in Asia, prominent examples of multi-gendered societies are the Bugis people of Indonesia, Hijra people of India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, and the McHugh people of Japan. The globalization of Western culture has ignored the gender identities that have existed in several Asian cultures for centuries. The blatant disregard for these quintessential identities invalidates identities that Western culture views as non-standard despite their having existed for centuries.
In the usual fashion of Western colonization, many of these multi-gendered identities have been wiped out of these societies or endangered by European Christian values. This erasure perpetuates the mistreatment and stigmatization of non-gender binary conforming people. Often, people who do not align with Western society's ideas of the gender binary have a difficult time coping with their identity because of the sensitivity their identities may hold. By encouraging education about societies that celebrate more than two genders, we can help generations of people feel more comfortable with themselves, as well as make society more inclusive and safe for everyone.
The Bugis people of South Sulawesi, Indonesia, are a prime example of the celebration and existence of several gender identities in one culture. According to a BBC travel article, quote, "In Bugis society, Makunrai and Oroani correspond to Western concepts of cis-female and cis-male. Kalaya are born with female bodies but take on traditionally male gender roles, and Chalabai are born with male bodies but take on female gender roles. The fifth Bugis gender is Bisu. Bisu are considered neither male nor female, but are representative of the totality of the gender spectrum. Bisu, like the Kalabai and Chalalai, display their identity through dress. Many Bisu are born intersex, but the term has implications beyond biology. While Bugis gender is often described as a spectrum, Bisu are deemed to be above this classification, spiritual beings who are not halfway between male and female, but rather embody the power of both at once, end quote.
The Hijra people from India are another example of cultural gender identities that defy the Western binary ideals. Located in India and surrounding countries, their presence in familiar events is often welcomed in Indian culture by letting them come into houses and bless newborn children. According to an article from Harvard, in Indian culture, a Hidra's blessing of a baby will confer fertility, prosperity, and the long life of the child. Hijra people are often born male, but express themselves with female clothing and mannerisms. The existence of their identity and community has been documented in Hindu holy texts like the Ramayana and Mahabharata, where Hindu hero Arjuna becomes a third gender. However, even with their long history, they have been prosecuted by many groups of people. During India and South Asia's colonization in the 19th and 20th centuries, Hijras were made criminals due to the law passed in 1871. Even through all of this prosecution, their identities and communities have stayed strong due to the crucial role they play in South Asian culture.
Despite the aforementioned evidence, some argue that the misreporting of gender statistics, lack of knowledge, and erasure of cultural non-binary gender identities is unrelated to the globalization of Eurocentric culture. They say that this is a natural occurrence that took place on its own, like how some aspects of culture gradually disappear just due to time, like how English rarely uses ducky as an adjective synonymous with pleasant anymore. Not because of acculturation, but just due to time. However, the culture loss of third gender identities can be directly traced to the globalization of European culture. Take the Wakashu people of Japan, for instance. Wakashu was a stage of life for young male Japanese people around adolescence, where they explored gender and sexuality fluidly and were seen as neither men nor women. This period was ended by a coming-of-age ceremony known as Genpuku. At this time, Japan was a fairly independent nation due to a seclusion policy called Sakoku, keeping the nation separated from Western influence. This policy ended in 1854 when ships of the U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay to negotiate treaties that would result in the opening of the country to Western trade and influences. The period of Wakashu started to fade a few years later in the 1860s as Japan started to adopt those Western practices.
Although gender identity erasure in Asia may seem like an issue too distant to help stop, there are many ways we can ensure we are not adding onto the problem. For example, you can educate yourself on the different cultural gender identities that have existed for centuries in Asia and other continents. By reading articles like the ones listed, you can expose yourself to different identities and communities, remembering to keep in mind how European cultural gender norms impact the existence of Asian cultural gender identities. Secondly, conversation about culture and gender within your own communities is crucial as it normalizes and breeds discussion and thought. The concept of the gender binary is not an idea that originated within these cultures, so the use of the term non-binary further enforces the gender binary onto these identities. By not generalizing cultural gender identities and instead using the correct terms for them, we can help preserve endangered culture norms in Asia and other continents.